What you're about to listen to is an interview with Dave Holland, a former United States Marine who has worked for almost 3 years on Guadalcanal, the site of one of the longest and hardest fought campaigns of World War II. Dave is vastly knowledgeable about the Pacific War, and more specifically, the Guadalcanal campaign. In this interview, we cover Operation Watchtower, the Battle of Alligator Creek, and the Battle of Bloody Ridge. Dave also runs a YouTube channel called Walking a Battlefield, where he takes you on a journey walking the battle sites of Guadalcanal. So go check him out. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast, week by week in association with Kings and Generals. I am your dutiful host, Craig Watson, and I am joined here today by Dave Holland. How are you, Dave?
Not bad, Craig. Thanks for having me on. It's a privilege.
And the subject is going to be about the Guadalcanal campaign, something that was of deep interest to me, especially from actually the Japanese point of view, in which Guadalcanal was kind of a hellish island where they were sent with almost no food or rations, and they suffered tremendously in the jungles to terrible diseases as well as being killed by the Marines. Quite a horror show for both sides, but I think the Japanese got it even worse than most. And if you want, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? And yeah.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I'm originally from the United States. You can probably tell from my accent, even though it's a hybrid accent between
a little bit Australian.
The southern United States and Australian. But originally, like I said, from the States. I did 8 years in the U.S. Marines and lived permanently in Australia, courtesy of an Australian wife. So the reason I became interested in Guadalcanal, I worked for the Australian government, and obviously being a military nut ever since I was about 6 years old, or probably earlier than that. That's my earliest memory. And a former U.S. Marine, and then working for the Australian government, I got a chance to visit Guadalcanal for short periods, and that was started in 2009. And you can imagine the excitement of going to Guadalcanal. And I said it before, it's been like an Australian soldier being posted, 2 years or 3 years to Gallipoli, or a Canadian soldier being posted years to Vimy Ridge in the Western Front, who's have a strong military interest of history. You're in your element. So all my available time, you can imagine, I spent walking the battlefields. And what I wanted to do was to delve deep into some of the, obviously the major battles, but also to go off to the side battles or skirmishes. Because Guadalcanal was a 6-month campaign, and it wasn't one battle, it was a campaign. It was multi-battles and multi-skirmishes. So I wanted to delve deep in that. And I read all the popular history and the detailed history of Guadalcanal, but I wanted to put boots on the ground, walk the ground, which I think is very important, and find out exactly, did it happen this way? Did it occur this way? With my military background, I could look at it from that point of view also. And then I started in 2009, so I went there. And I did a 4-month trip, and that allowed me to get, to start to scratch the surface a bit, just to get excited. And then from 2011 and 12, I did short trips. And during that time there, I gave a lot of battlefield study programs to the Australian Army and Australia and New Zealand, and some of the American Marines who was over there at times, battlefield study programs. I did a lot of battlefield tours, battlefield walks. But then in 2018, had the opportunity to be posted for 2 years in Guadalcanal. So I could really delve deep, and I did some, I went so deep, I lost my breath, so to speak, and I run out of air, so to speak, in a lot of places. But I'm tending to go back. Currently, Guadalcanal is, I guess, banned for tourism. It's banned for any outside visitors due to COVID. And unfortunately, COVID has just kicked over for the first time over in the Solomon Islands. So you can imagine. Yeah, that's probably earlier this year it kicked in. So they've been closed almost 3 years. And this is the 80th, as you know, this is the 80th anniversary to Guadalcanal. So it's going to be a big year for tourism. So hopefully, we probably won't make the August I don't think it's going to be open up by August for the anniversary, but hopefully by the end of the year. So to answer your initial question, yes, that's my interest in Guadalcanal. And I also run a YouTube site called Guadalcanal, Walking a Battlefield. So basically what I've done, I made that YouTube site for people who've only been to Guadalcanal, maybe for the short 1 week tour or a few days, and for the people who never go to Guadalcanal. And then I walk the battlefield. It's like giving a battlefield study, a battlefield tour. And I'm doing it, and it's off the beaten track on a lot of these sites. And I keep updating it as we go. And I'd like to walk in the battlefield, but in the meantime, until I can go back, I do some episodes. And I also have a Facebook site, same title, Guadalcanal Walking the Battlefields, which I'd update every 2 or 3 days. And I do a lot of then and now photos. I try to post material that's very original that no one's ever seen before or rarely seen. Yeah. And I also help out authors and researchers on Guadalcanal. So that's my interest.
Yeah, I saw there's an iconic photo of I don't know if it's Alligator Creek. Oh, no, I don't know which battle it is, but there's a lot of Japanese dead on a beach, and you had done a walk, and you had put together the photo of you or the filming of you walking on that same beach, and you spliced it with this iconic photo. I've never seen anything like that before. It was very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I have to I don't know if I'll take credit for the then and nows. A lot of the then and now photos comes from a fellow in Australia, is a good friend of mine called Peter Flahavin. And he runs a site too, and he's been doing it for years. I mean, he's been visiting Guadalcanal since the early 90s, and he does a lot of then and now. I think he probably has the world's largest private collection of Guadalcanal photos. And if you ever seen his work, he's amazing. But yeah, we work together. But it is, the battlefields a lot of them are preserved. A lot of them have been built over, but a lot of them are actually preserved too. Do the good then and now.
That's really interesting. So I guess to start this off, as I know a lot of the general audience is probably quite confused when it comes to island hopping warfare in general. But I found when I was younger, when I was in my teens, and I was influenced by things like the Pacific series on HBO, for example, I found it kind of hard at first to grasp, like, why are these men on Guadalcanal? Why are the Japanese there? And what's the importance of it? So maybe you can help explain a bit about why was there a Guadalcanal campaign?
Okay, I won't delve too deep into it. Obviously, you viewers are quite aware of Pearl Harbor and the reasons why the Allies got into the war. But we'll put us, let's say, in early 1942 in the Solomon Islands, and why the Japanese were there and why the Allies were there. Well, the Japanese, as you know, they were expanding quite rapidly. And because they had the victory fever after 6 months, they decided, well, we'll keep pushing down into the Southwest Pacific or South Pacific. And what they intended to do was to take Port Moresby in New Guinea, and also continue on down to the Solomon Islands and then into Fiji, Samoa, New Caledonia. The main goal there was to cut off the supply line to Australia. And the Japanese had thought if they could cut Australia off, potentially Australia could sue for a separate peace. Yeah. We know now that Australia, they had no serious intentions of invading Australia. The Australian public and the New Zealand public didn't know it at the time. They thought, he was coming south with that famous propaganda photo. They were on war footing. They were very, very, I wouldn't say afraid, but they were very concerned that the Japanese were going to invade Australia and New Zealand. But the Japanese were going to cut off the South Pacific and cut off that vital supply line, because that was the only way Australia was getting supplies. And also, too, it would deny the U.S. a major staging area for a fight back. So Australia was going to be the major base they were going to stage out of to their fight back, especially MacArthur being the supreme commander, the fight back to the New Guinea and up that way to the Philippines. So if you remember in May 42, the Battle of Coral Sea, I don't know if you haven't covered that yet. I think in your series, you're getting close.
Ooh, it's getting really close
to it, yes. But the intention of the Japanese was to invade Port Moresby and take Port Moresby, and they could control that airfield, and that would allow them to help interdict the shipping and also to strike some of the Northern Australian cities and bases and airfields that the Allies had. So the Port Moresby invasion was the Battle of Coral Sea, so the Americans and the Australians stopped them. At the same time they were going to hit Port Moresby, a small contingent was going to, I guess, veer off and hit a place called Tulagi. Now, it brings us to the Solomon Islands. Now, Tulagi was a British, well, the Solomon Islands was a British protectorate. So the British ran Solomon Islands. Wasn't much happening in the Solomon Islands at the time, but there was, had copper or coconut plantations. You know, it was a main, I guess, resource they exported. So basically, what happened then was Tulagi was the capital, British capital colonial seat of the whole area. The Australians, after December 41, had a small seaplane base there at Tanambogo. So Tanambogo, Gavutu, and Tulagi were all little islands very near each other. So the Japanese decided at the same time they were hitting Port Moresby, they would take Tulagi. Now, by taking Tulagi, what that would provide, one, it provide a coverage for their western, I guess, to cover their eastern flank, or to cover the Japanese left flank, and also to provide a future staging area for an advance down to the rest of the South Pacific. Because Tulagi had it still does, obviously, it has a large fleet anchorage. Mm-hmm. You could put a large fleet in there. It's one of the best anchorage in the South Pacific. So obviously I won't put the spoiler out there, or this is a spoiler, they didn't win the Battle of Coral Sea. They were turned back. So the Japanese had to hit northern New Guinea and go over the Kokoda Trail, or Kokoda Track, as some people call it. So they landed at Bunangoda and came over to the fight. But they still held Tulagi. And the Australians and the British, I guess, fled very quickly. They left behind a few coast watchers. And I'm trying not to delve too deep into details. So the Americans, after the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Midway gave the Allies, I guess, a push to start some offensive operations.
Yeah, it's like a turning capability to do offensives. Yeah. Yes,
I mean, it wasn't. It's arguable. Some people say it's the turning point. For me, the turning point of a campaign is when the strategic initiative shifts.
Yeah.
But after Midway, the strategic initiative did not shift in the Pacific because the Japanese were well on the offensive.
They were still
pushing south, as you know, in the South Pacific. Because you had, it wasn't until the late October, November that the Japanese stopped their offensive operations on Guadalcanal. Because Guadalcanal, and I'll get to in a second, was a Japanese offensive operations, even though the Allies started the offensive, but they went quickly to the defense. But so Admiral King, which is the chief of naval operations, he wanted to have a limited offensive. Even before Midway, he wanted to have a limited offensive in the Pacific. They started with some carrier sweeps in the Pacific and did some raids, but they gave them a little bit of the shift in Midway gave them a bit of a chance to push their offensive ahead of time. So you had the 1st Marine Division. They were coming to New Zealand, and they were coming to New Zealand for a couple of reasons. One, to garrison the island, because you can remember all the Australians in New Zealand, their main troops were fighting over in Europe. And the whole 2nd New Zealand Division was at that time probably 41, 42, it was fighting in North Africa.
Yeah, it's a North African campaign. Yeah.
So they had the militia there. So one, they were going to garrison, and two, they were going to train for 6 months, and to become the first striking, or the main striking point for the Allies. So once they landed with the 1st contingent, which is a regiment and the headquarters element. And they had another regiment at the sea coming, and their 7th Marine Regiment was garrisoned Samoa at the time. So Admiral King told Admiral Nimitz, who was the head admiral in the Pacific, basically, I want you to go on the offensive. And then he gave him the date of 1 August. I won't go into too much detail here, but basically what it did, that set the stage for Guadalcanal. The initial operation was going to call Operation Pestilence. It was called Operation Pestilence, in fact, and that was they were going to take Tulagi, the surrounding islands. Then the Marines were going to hit Bougainville. Then they're going to hit Rabaul. And then Operation Watchtower was going to be the Tulagi and the surrounding islands. Now, initially, like I said, it was Tulagi and the surrounding islands because of the Japanese seaplane base. But when I mentioned the Coast Watcher guys they left behind a couple or 3 of them on Guadalcanal. One of them was Martin Clemens. between Martin Clemens and his native scouts, they worked out the Japanese were building, or seen the intel they sent out, the Japanese were building an airfield. And how that came about, the Japanese were at Tulagi. They were sending, I guess, reconnaissance parties over to Guadalcanal to get cattle, because before it was coconut plantations, like I mentioned before. So they had a lot of cattle there, obviously to cut down the grass in the coconut plantations, and obviously to provide some beef steak. But the Japanese, they were on Tulagi, and they said, "Oh, let's go over to Guadalcanal and get some beef steak." So they started looking at, at the beef steak and bringing the cows back, and then they started looking at the Lunga Plains, and they said, "We could build an airfield here. Cut these coconut trees down, and we could build an airfield." And it would really be strategic value to us to do that. So within 2 weeks, they had the 11th and the 13th construction units, mainly composed of Korean and some Japanese laborers.
Yeah, the Koreans.
And they started clearing the fields. And then the Coast Guard said, "Look, they're building an airfield here. B-17s were doing some bombing raids there." Most people don't even realize that the U.S. bombed the airfield to start with B-17s before the Japanese could complete it. And then the reconnaissance planes picked it up. So that was the reason Tulagi and surrounding islands then became the surrounding islands, Tulagi and Guadalcanal, to take out that airstrip, because the Allies knew they had this unsinkable aircraft carrier with that airstrip. If they could take it, they could deny the Australians to cut it off. Yep. So I probably went a bit deep in that, setting the stage. But yeah, we're there now, August 42.
I'll let the audience know that there's actually video footage of the Japanese construction of Henderson Field. It's pretty interesting stuff. It's well capped too. It shows kind of I don't want to say a lack of construction capability, but certainly a disparity between the Americans and Japanese. The Japanese, it would take them a long time to build those airfields, and they weren't up to standard. We'll say that.
Yeah, they had to bring a lot of equipment in. I think they were bringing them in at the time. But we'll see later, once the Marines landed, they loved any bit of the Japanese gear they captured from them.
Yeah. So I guess from this point on, some of the first battles, would you want to delve into Tulagi or Gavutu?
Yeah, I can talk about it briefly. So on August the 7th, the Marines were going to hit, just like I said before, Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Now, Tulagi had the 3rd Special Naval Landing Force garrison it, and plus some not construction troops, some engineers and some Japanese sailors. And Tanimbogo and Gavutu was 2 nearby islands, probably 600-700 yards away. And it held the air base, seaplane base. So it had a lot of air personnel and a few support personnel there too.
It was
about 350. It had about 350 Japanese on Tulagi. Now, they were dug in. The Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, I mean, some people call them Japanese Marines, but they wasn't in the Marines as the U.S. or the British Royal Marines were.
Yeah, the Special Landing Naval Force, they're the equivalent of Marines, but they're not necessarily the same as the United States Marines now. Yeah,
like they call them naval infantry. Yeah. They were like sailors trained to be infantrymen, and they were trained to be assault troops. And the guys on the 3rd Curie, I think they were the 3rd Curie, because they're named after their naval base. Special Naval Landing Force at Tulagi were mainly reservists. But in saying that, these reservists, I think the average age is in their 30s, but they were pretty switched on guys. If you've seen a photo of them, there's a famous photo. They're officers and NCOs, and they're all fairly large and very capable looking fellas. Anyway, they dug in on Tulagi, and the Marines knew that it was going to be a hard fight at Gavutu, Tanimbogo, and Tulagi. So they sent the best troops they had at the time, which was the Marine Raider Battalion, 1st Raider Battalion, and the 1st Marine Paratrooper Battalion, the Parachute Battalion. And they sent the 2nd Battalion, the 5th Marines, which is a well-trained battalion also. At the time, too, they were supported by the 2nd Marines Regiment. Now, you'll hear Marines talk about, and some of your viewers, it can get confusing when they're reading things. When people refer to the 2nd Marines or the 1st Marines or the 5th Marines or the 8th Marines, they're not talking about divisions. Well, in the U.S. Army and the other NATO forces, they say, the 1st the 1st Infantry or the 2nd Infantry. They mean the division. The Marines, when you say 1st Marines, that means regiment. If they say 1st Marine Division, then obviously that's division. So that sometimes that can get confusing. I've seen things about Iwo Jima, and they say, the 5th Marines were at Iwo Jima. So, well, 5th Marines wasn't Iwo Jima. The 5th Marine Division was at Iwo Jima. So that can get confusing at times. Anyway, the 2nd Marine Regiment, was a part of the 2nd Marine Division. Well, they were given on loan to the 1st Marine Division because, like I said earlier, the 7th Marine Regiment was one of the core regiments of the 1st Division, was garrisoned Samoa at the time. Had the famous Marines in it, like H.H. Hannikin and Puller and Basilone and Page. They fleshed out this regiment with the best NCOs and officers and the best troops and the best equipment to ship them out quickly, thinking they were going to be the first to fight. But, ironically, they weren't the first to fight. They joined later in September. But so you had the 2nd Marines there for support. So they landed at, the Japanese expected them to land on one side of the island, which is the only feasible landing bases at Tulagi. But the Marines landed on the other side of the island at Beach Blue, which had coral reefs. They came over the coral reefs early in the morning, about 8 o'clock on the 7th. And they had to jump out of the boats about 100 yards off the shore. They came in, not a shot was fired to surprise the Japanese. And then basically they attacked across the island, had limited resistance till they got to the very the southeast end of the island. And then they hit a cave complex, Hill 281. And, the fight was on for 281. So that night the Marines dug in. The Japanese did some limited counterattacks, and then the Marines finished them up the next day. So it was the first time the Marines or the Allies had experienced the Japanese, how the Japanese had set the stage, how the Japanese would fight for the rest of the Pacific campaign. We're dug in these caves, we're dug in these bunkers, you're going to have to kill us all. They only captured 3 Japanese out of 350. Now, at the same time, I wouldn't say at the same time, probably midday, then about 12 o'clock, the 1st Parachute Battalion attacked Gavutu. And they attacked Gavutu. Gavutu is a very, very small island, and Tanimbogo are very small islands. So the 1st Marine Parachute Battalion hit it head on. And that was the first opposed landing any Marines had in World War II. And they were pinned down on the Lever Brothers was the coconut plantation owners, corporation before the war. So that was where the headquarters was based at, Lever Brothers. So if you look on some of my YouTube videos, I've got Tulagi and Tanimbogo, and it shows the wharf. The wharf remnants are still there. And anyway, they were pinned down there for a while, and they ended up, after a hard fight, had to get reinforced by the 2nd Marines. They sent a battalion from the 2nd Marine Regiment in to support them. And then the next day, they attacked Tanimbogo. There was a concrete causeway that connected both of them. The Marines tried to do a small amphibious assault by a rifle company the day before on the 7th. They were beaten back.
That was a controversial decision too, that one. I think it was Rupertus who sent the unit, and it was one company, wasn't it? Or
it was about a reinforced company.
Yeah.
And they got hit and had to pull back. And then the next day they had a concentrated effort, with close fire and supporting fire on Tanimbogo, and they charged across the causeway. I could talk just on this alone, but then it had 2 tanks, and the 2 tanks supported 2 M3 Stuarts. They supported, and they were actually taken out. There was one scene where the Japanese had stopped it. I think they threw a pipe or a bar in its tracks and stopped it. And then all the 30, 40 Japanese, just like ants, just jumped on top of it and was, pulling the crew out and bashing them to death and trying to burn it. And the Marines had to, I think some naval gunfire knocked a few of them off too. But anyway, after 2 days of hard fighting, Tulagi, Tanimbogo, and Gavutu were taken. But at the same time, in August the 7th, the 1st Marine Division, at 8 o'clock in the morning, was landing on Beach Red, or Red Beach, which is about 6,000 or 8,000 yards away from Lunga Point in the airfield. So regional Marines picked that area. The Marine intelligence basically told them that Japanese, there were probably 3,000 to 4,000 Japanese there, and it was a whole Japanese infantry regiment. And they were going to be dug in on Lunga Point. That's where the Marines wanted to hit, was Lunga Point, because it was the Lunga Point is right above the airfield, and they could hit it and take the airfield quickly.
Yeah, you get the
So
point, you get the airfield.
yes, and it was a good beaches to land on. All the beaches there are quite good. So they picked about 6,000 yards to the east at Red Beach, and the reason they kind of picked it was they thought it was going to be undefended. They didn't really want to hit there, but it was hit them where they're not, so to speak. That was the saying. It was a very insulated beach. I mean, it's like a concave. It's like that. So it's not the best place to do amphibious invasion because you could put guns here, and you could just infiltrate the beach. But luckily for the Marines, when they landed, it was without firing a shot. If you ever see the movie or the HBO,
Pacific, yeah, they're very surprised that they're not seeing any resistance. Even go a little bit further in, they're not finding. Well, they find some of the equipment the Japanese left, but yeah.
yes, and I think the only casualty, I still haven't confirmed it. I mean, you read it in all the reports that was a Marine cut his hand on a coconut. The only casualty.
I think that was shown in the Pacific too. Yeah.
It probably did. I mean, I don't know if it's an urban myth, but it's probably true because I've read it on numerous accounts. But so that was August the 7th. So they've landed, and so at this stage you had about 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal, and you had roughly about 4 to 5,000 on the other islands of Tulagi and Gavutu and Tanambogo.
All right.
So they landed.
Marines are on Guadalcanal.
Yep. So they landed, and they were supposed to. They wanted to really take the airfield on the first day. They didn't. So the 5th Marines moved down the coast. They got as far as Alligator Creek or Ilu River. On their maps are pretty bad. They had maps drawn basically from reconnaissance photos and also from the knowledge of the former planters and British colonial officers. You know, for example, if you look at the original map, and I've seen the original map they had, they gave out to the troops, they had the grassy knoll, which is Mount Austin. It was like 1,600 yards away, but it was something like 3 or 4 miles away. If you go there to Guadalcanal, you'll look at it, and it dominates the airfield. And they never reached it. Well, they reached it later in campaigns, but the Marines kind of let it go. So the 1st Marine Regiment punched in a bit, and they were supposed to take the grassy knoll, but they got caught up in the swamps and the jungle. And basically they were recalled back. The 5th Marines were supposed to push across Ilu River, Alligator Creek. And because they were green troops, and some of their commanders, like the regiment commander, he was a good commander, but he was old and a bit slow, wasn't as aggressive as some of the younger guys. So I think the division commander had to come up and push him a bit. So the next day they took the airfield. A few sporadic sniper fires, but they surprised the Japanese. The Japanese actually thought the Marines were landing. It was a raid. And that's why the storage, they left the safes open. They left everything it is. Think the Marines would come in, grab it, and run like a amphibious raid. So they all moved to the jungle. I'm just waiting the Marines out. They said they'll leave the next day and we'll go back to our camps. But Marines stayed for years, so to speak. The Japanese fled west. So they ran to the jungle and fled west. There were some combat troops there. There were a guard company, might have been 2 guard companies, but most of them were construction troops. And a lot of them, I don't know exactly how many, but it had to be over 1,000, were Korean laborers. And the Marines called them termites. The Japanese called them a certain name, but obviously they weren't treated that well by the Japanese.
Yeah, they were with the way the Japanese command works, it's the highest ranking officer abuses the people under him, they abuse the people under them, and then when it goes down the pyramid, it's the Korean laborers who get beaten or POWs.
Yeah, the pecking order, so to speak.
Yeah, it's
because you read a lot of POWs, like you said, their accounts of the Korean guards, because the Japanese said it was beneath them to guard POWs, so they used the Taiwan, the Formosans, and the Koreans. Yeah.
The Koreans were the most likely, even though even they didn't surrender often, to surrender.
Well, they didn't have a choice to surrender. A lot of times they tried to surrender, probably shot out of sight. Another thing too, the Marines initially, if you've seen any POW, there's a lot of POW photos in the initial days of Guadalcanal, and we call them the beach caps. In Australia, they call them the giggle caps, or the bush caps. You'll see some photos of some guys like that. If you ever see those photos, they're generally the Korean laborers. But a lot of Koreans surrendered. In the 1940s, they'd labeled them all Japanese POWs. They didn't say Korean POWs, Japanese POWs. And like Sewell and a few of the other Marine photographers, some of their photos that were coming back, they still labeled to this day Japanese POWs, and most of them are Korean. and you'll see. And they used the Koreans. I'm trying to get a little sidetrack here. They used the Koreans for a lot of burial parties and working parties. And the Koreans, it was said, if you read speaking to one veteran, the Koreans loved burying the Japanese in the burial parties. They loved, and I've got some photos. I got some photos of the Koreans actually burying the Japanese, Alligator Creek and Coffin Corner. They're assisting the Japanese whole burial parties.
Wow.
And I guarantee you can see some of them laughing because obviously the way they were treated by the Japanese, there was no love lost.
No, they were starved and beaten.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, and some of those poor guys tried to surrender to the Marines from their beginning, but, the Marines, especially being Green troops, and they wasn't taking any precautions, so to speak. Some of these poor guys got shot out of hand, but then they worked out that let's capture some of these guys, once they got a bit of control of the Marines. Not saying the Marines were undisciplined or anything, but you can imagine in a very tense situation like that, especially at night.
Yeah, they got their hands on a warrant officer, I think, who ended up giving them some intelligence.
Yeah, that's the Getchy Patrol. That's another one I could do a whole episode on. I plan to do one. I'm working on one for my channel now. The Getchy. So it brings us to the Marines dug in. They formed a horse shape, about a 15-mile perimeter, or 18-mile horseshoe-shaped perimeter. It wasn't a full perimeter on Lunga Point because they didn't have enough troops for that. So they had troops on the east, west, in the frontage, which is the amphibious assault. They're being Marines. They're expecting the Japanese are doing amphibious assault with a counterattack. They knew the Japanese would counterattack very quickly. So they beefed up their east flank, west flank, and the Lunga Point flank. But they left the southern flank basically unguarded. I mean, I wouldn't say completely unguarded. They had outposts on their southern flanks, and they also had roving patrols. But they didn't have enough troops to do a full 360 perimeter. It wasn't until like September the 18th when the 7th Marine Regiment landed that Archer Vandegrift, who was the division commander, had enough troops to do a full garrison. So initially when the Marines landed, that was the first offensive by the U.S. in World War II, the first offensive action, 7th of August. But as soon as they landed, they became defensive. Like I mentioned earlier, the Japanese were on the offensive, still on the offensive in that time. So once the Marines landed, they took the offensive, took something, and they dug in and they waited. And the whole objective, in fact, you could probably say for the 6-month period, one of the most important piece of terrain in the whole South Pacific was Henderson Field, the unsinkable aircraft carrier. Because the Americans ever lost it, it was highly doubtful they would retain Guadalcanal, because once they landed some planes there, it brings me up the Bloody Ridge, I guess, or sorry, Alligator Creek.
Yeah, of course.
So the Marines, after about a week, they completed the airfield. The Japanese had almost completed it. In fact, they were having a bit of a party the night before. It's kind of a completion party. Well, that's what some of the Marines said. There was enough sake and beer when the Marines landed. And as soon as the Marines landed the warehouses, they put Marine guards very quickly on those to keep the sake and the beer.
I bet they did, yeah.
The wraps. Yeah. But that brings me to a point where the Marines, I won't talk about Battle of Savo Island because that's another episode, but Battle of Savo Islands was probably the in August the 9th was the greatest surface defeat in U.S. naval history. Yeah, Australian cruiser lost there. I mean, they lost 4 cruisers in a period of 30 minutes. You had over 1,000 sailors died in less than 30 minutes.
Yep.
And to put that in perspective, 1,600 U.S. Marines and U.S. soldiers died on land in the whole 6-month campaign. But in 30 minutes on August the 9th, 8th and 9th, you had over 1,000 sailors went down in less than 30 minutes. Over 5,500 sailors, U.S. sailors and Australian sailors, mainly U.S. sailors, died in the 6-month campaign of Guadalcanal. So but what happened after that, the Navy had to pull their ships out.
Yeah, the great logistical issue.
Air cover. Yeah, they gave him, he promised him 2 days of air cover, but he pulled out before because they'd lost a lot of air and fighter planes in the last couple of days, and then their fuel. So Fletcher had already pulled out. But when the morning came and there was no coverage for the transport, Turner, the amphibious assault commander, pulled the transports out. So it left when the transports left, a lot of the Marine supplies left with them because Marines they'd combat loaded because once they reached New Zealand, they had to reload their ships, and they combat loaded as best they could. They'd leave a lot behind. They combat loaded enough supplies for 60 days worth of food and 4 days worth of fighting or ammunition and things for fighting, sustained fighting. So when they pulled out, they reckon they only had about 30 days of rations, if that, and probably about 2 days of fighting, full-on fighting. They call it units of fire in those days. So luckily for them, and when you hear anyone's read anything about Guadalcanal, they talk about how the Marines survived on the Japanese rice and Japanese supplies, which is true. The Japanese left tons of rice, tons of tin, fish, and other things. And they left a lot of equipment. A lot of it was in pretty bad repair. But I've got a list of all the stuff that the Marines captured, I guess, from the Japanese construction equipment. Marines were able to offload one bulldozer. And that bulldozer, I don't know if it's called Old Faithful, and I forgot the name of it, but they used it a lot. And they used some Japanese bulldozers and rollers and stuff. Between the Marine pioneers and the engineers, and the pioneers are like combat engineers, they completed the runway after about a week. So now they had to wait for airplanes. And so on August the 20th was a good day for the Marines because the first two Marine squadrons landed. You had a squadron of Wildcats and a squadron of dive bombers. And they both landed. And in fact, the division commander met them at the airfield, kind of high-fived them when they came off, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I think it was Enterprise that brought them. So 12 Dauntless or 14 Wildcats, 12 Dauntless.
I think it was about 30 planes all up. Yeah. And that was
welcomed.
Yeah, Smith and Magnum and the rest of these guys. So they landed. At the same time, then the Japanese, their intel, and the Marines suffered from it, the U.S. suffered from this too, the lack of intel. That was one of the, I guess, common themes in the Guadalcanal campaign. So the Japanese intel basically stated there's probably about 2,500 to 3,000 Marines. It was a raid. Obviously, they're going to hit. They didn't leave, but they just take this airfield. There's a small amount of Marines going to hold it. So you can imagine at that time, the Japanese had not been real defeated. I mean, they've had a few setbacks in, Malaya and Bataan and in a few other places, as you guys covered in your series already. I seen your series the other day, and it was in the Philippines where they wiped out 2 Japanese infantry battalions. And I said, I didn't think the Japanese had lost that much, but yeah, it wiped out 2 whole battalions. So it's something you don't read much about. But the Japanese, to put it back what I was talking about, the Japanese had never suffered any major setbacks or major defeats. So they're on the roll, so to speak, and had that victory fever.
Victory disease was rampant in them.
Yeah, exactly. And they underestimated, the intel, underestimated their opponents. So they thought, well, they're holding a large perimeter. There's only about 2 to 3,000 of them we can easily punch through. So I had a unit called the 28th Regiment, which is one of their best assault units. And the 20th Regiment was slated to go into Midway. They were supposed to invade Midway. And Colonel Ichiki was their commander. And he was a pretty good commander, too. If you ever read the Marco Polo incidents and stuff, he was involved in the Marco Polo incident in 1937.
Yeah.
He was one of the commanders on the scene. He was one of their infantry instructors. So it was rated very high. So let me just get this right. They went to, after they didn't get to invade Midway, so they went to.
Fortunate for them.
Guam, yeah. Either on Guam, I think Guam or Truk at the time. I think it might have been on Guam.
It was Guam, yeah.
Yeah, they're getting orders to go back to Tokyo. And the Japanese 17th Army, which was based in Rabaul, remember, they were fighting, their main objective was Port Moresby. They were fighting on Kokoda. They're fighting for Port Moresby. The Army didn't really want to deal with Guadalcanal because they thought, we don't want to get sidetracked, the 17th Army commander. So they said, what units do we have now not to deviate from the units we have in New Guinea? And they said, well, we've got the 28th Regiment. I'll send those guys down. So Ichiki took his best guys and formed the first echelon, about 1,000, a little over 1,000 men. They put them on fast transports. They shot them straight down to Tavu Point, which is in the eastern side of Guadalcanal.
Yeah,
And they landed.
they used destroyers for this because they had to get them over so fast. They had very few days worth of rations. It was a real quick deal.
Yeah, because they thought, well, we'll take these guys. Well, they gave the Cheeky landed at Tabu Point. They gave them these orders were basically to either make an assessment. If you think you could take it, take it. If not, wait to your second echelon. Another 500 or 600 guys will be landing. They had some of his artillery and heavy guns in the second echelon. Just wait for them and do a concentrated attack. The Cheeky landed. They did his reconnaissance. I won't go into too much in detail about a patrol called the Brush Patrol with the Marines attacked and killed a lot of their officers. Anyway, they made the assessment, and the Cheeky, we don't really know what he was thinking at the time. Japanese infantry tactics at that stage basically pushed for a night assault, infiltration techniques. The old bamboo spear tactics where they just run straight in with a bamboo, bamboo with a bayonet and attack a concentrated point. And they also use infiltration tactics, like I said. If they could go around it, they would. And
I love to get around the units and surprise them.
Yeah, that was what they did. And I equate it like I was taught many years ago in the Marines about maneuver warfare. It's just like if you take water and pour it down a hill, it takes the path of least resistance and goes around an obstacle. And that's what you do. Unfortunately, they didn't decentralize the command with the Japanese NCOs and junior officers. Once they got command to, this is your assault plan, they didn't have anything like we do now with the commander's intent or the Western forces, where you don't give that initiative to the junior leaders, because on the battlefield, things could change very quickly, and you need to have that initiative to go, okay, my commander's intents to do this, so I'm going to push toward that goal. Especially with the Japanese army at the time, they said, take that hill. They will take that hill no matter what cost. They won't go around the hill, whatever. They might with infiltration, but if whatever their last orders are, that's what they'll do. Assault that hill, they will assault the hill. But anyway, Alligator Creek or Ilu River, on the Marine maps at the time it's called the Tenaru River, mislabeled. The Marines had some intel that the Japanese were coming. They knew the Japanese regular army was there. Like I said before, the Brush Patrol was named after a Marine captain who ambushed the Japanese down the track. The Japanese didn't expect the Marines to do active, aggressive patrolling, so they ambushed a Japanese patrol, killed a number of officers, and they found out these guys are very fresh. The Japanese regular army, they hadn't seen any regular army at that time. They're here. Then you had some Solomon Island scouts. I'll put a plug in for the Solomon Islanders. I know the family of this fellow is called Jacob Vuza. He's a very, very famous. He's the most famous Solomon Islander, Sir Jacob Vuza, I should say. And everyone that's read the Guadalcanal campaign knows about Vuza. There's statues of Vuza's there. He was a former British colonial police officer, sergeant major in the police force, and just retired, Vuza. And he started working for Clemens, and he started doing scouting behind the lines. Anyway, he was captured too at one stage by the Japanese, and they bayoneted him, tied to a tree, and beat him up quite bad, and said, "Look, tell us about the Marines." There's a few accounts on it, but the account it seems to ring the truth is that they untied him, and they had his hands tied, and he says, "I'll show you where they are. Come follow me." He knew how many Marines were there, and he was leading them there. And, they had him with bayonets. They'd already stabbed him in a bit. But then once he got to a certain point, the Marines outpost started shooting and stuff. Then they bayoneted him, and he jumped into the bushes and ran. And he popped out. The PFC called Bruley. Bruley seen him popping out over the river. And he said, "Me no Jap man, me Vuza, no shoot them," or something like that in Pidgin. And he was bleeding half to death. And he said, "The Japanese are coming. There's a whole bunch of them." But it isn't like the old Paul Revere saying, Vuza, the Marines are just sitting there doing nothing. And, Vuza ran out of the jungle. "Oh, the Japanese are coming." And then, it saved the Marines. But he did give some great information that it helped. He later became very valuable to the Marines in his scouting. He wasn't expected to live. And Vuza always said he was like 50% American because they gave him blood transfusions. It's quite a funny story. I wouldn't say funny story, but Martin Clemens, when they brought Vuza in, he gave the information. He's laying there, and they thought he was dying, so they had him outside the hospital or a tent or something. And they've called for Martin Clemens, and they said, "Oh, one of your men's here." And he goes, "I'll be with him at least to his end." He goes, "Oh, he started asking him. He said, 'Tell me,' and he says, basically my last testament. Okay, and he's tell me, tell Aunt so and so and tell Uncle so and so, and he started talking more and more and more. He says, "Well, maybe he's not dying." He says, "Can we get this guy to the hospital?" So I got him to the hospital and I started getting blood transfusions. So he get American blood, so to speak. And he used to say he was 50% American and saved him. But he really became very valuable, especially during the long patrol by Carlson's Raiders in November. Vuza. I'm trying not to get very detailed here, but I could go off on any of these little tangents and talk about any of them. But anyway, bring you back to the Japanese. The Japanese were, the Marines had the outpost there. They knew the Japanese were coming. Now, what the Marines, 3 or 4 days before, the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Marine Regiment had dug in, the whole battalion with 2 companies and had another reserve. They dug in on the west bank of the Alligator Creek. And they dug in, they had like coconut log bunkers. They had overhead covers with sandbags, as much sandbags. They didn't have much sandbag. Because when the Marines, they only offloaded 18 spools of barbed wire. The rest of them got punched away. And they used a lot of the barbed wire from the coconut plantations. They stripped the coconut plantation barbed wires and reused them.
Huh. Okay.
In fact, on the sandbar, which was only passable because they had a coastal track, like a plantation track, government track. And it wasn't no bridge over the Ilu River. It ran on the sandbar. And that was the crossing point to sandbar at any vehicles on certain times of day, obviously. And what the Marines did, one, I guess, very motivated private, I guess you could say, told his lieutenant, he goes, "Sir, some barbed wire here off this old plantation barbed wire. Can I put one strand over the sandbar mouth?" He goes, "Yeah, that's a good idea, Private. Go do it." So they did that. They put one strand, all they had one strand of barbed wire. They put about apparently knee high. That was the Marines' secret weapon. So the Japanese attacked at night. They said, "What we'll do, we'll do a full-on assault directly across the mouth of the river. Bamboo spear tactics. They had some 70 millimeter guns, small infantry howitzers, had some heavy machine guns, and had their 50 millimeter grenade launchers, or knee mortars, as some people call them. And they had enough there to provide some form of a base of fire against the Marine position. But to go back to what I was saying, the Marines had 2 reinforced companies, or 2 companies. When I said reinforced, they had heavy weapons. So they had some 37 millimeter anti-tank guns and heavy machine guns and some 50 cal. And they had them dug in on those bunkers all on the east bank. And they were supported. The Marines had 4 battalions of artillery. They had 3 battalions of 75 millimeter howitzers, mountain howitzers, and they had a battalion of 105 millimeters. Their 5th battalion was still in New Zealand. That was 155 millimeters. But because of weight, they didn't bring them over until, I think, the last of October, November. Anyway, they were supported, heavily supported, and obviously had the 81 millimeter, 61 millimeter mortars all sighted in. So the Japanese hadn't really hit any concentration like that. These Marines, a lot of the special guys in the 1st Marine Regiment was all joined after January of 42. So they're very junior. They had good NCOs, very experienced NCOs and officers, but very junior Marines. They only had 6 months of training, but they're very keen. They're very young, 18, 19 years old. These guys, the Marines had the youngest per average of all the U.S. Armed Forces. I think the average age of a U.S. Army soldier was 25 or 26. The average age of a Marine was 19. All these young, motivated kids, do anything. Anyway, they had them dug in. The Japanese did that night. They did 2 assaults across the mouth of the 2 major assaults across the mouth of the Alligator Creek. Now we'll go back to that barbed wire that young, motivated PFC put out. The Japanese at night was advancing. You can imagine they clumped them in. They're advancing across the mouth, and the Marines knew they were coming.
It was interesting his choice to just go straight through that from the Japanese.
They really have another choice. It was more of a tidal. If you look at my my video on Alligator Creek, you'll see it's still just like it is today. It's more a tidal lagoon. It's fairly deep there too. It's a tidal lagoon. I mean, it does have fresh water that comes in. It's mainly a tidal lagoon. So it's fairly wide there, and it's you wouldn't try to, and there is some crocodiles in there. I think at the time after the Marines were there for a while, the crocodiles left because you put a few thousand Marines in there, the crocodiles are not going to hang around. But you hear the stories, the crocodiles are eating that night. I don't know if that's true, but it sounds pretty cool. Now, they attacked across the mouth, and the first Japanese hit that barbed wire, and it momentarily stunned them or stopped them. They didn't know what to, because you can imagine trying to run across, all of a sudden you hit a barbed wire, and it was like an accordion effect. The guys in the front stopped, the guys in the back hit them. And when they did that roughly at the same time, and the Marines said started yelling and jabbering, and they didn't know what was going on. And that's when they opened up with a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun, firing 128, 126 pellets of 30 cal. It'd be like 130 something rifles going off at the same time. Giant shotgun blast, just cut them down like a scythe. And then the heavy machine guns started opening up, the mortars and the rifles and the BARs and everything started just pounding. And they had some good enfilade and grazing fire, the Marines. The grazing fire, as you know, is you put a machine gun about knee high, and you fire the grazing fire. That's what machine guns fire. And normally they cut you down and then hit you in the head or the rest of your body, and they cut you down. That's what it's designed for, because you want to put your machine guns high, because might fire high. Grazing fire is great fire. And enfilade fire, I mean, look at World War I. Enfilade fire killed thousands. So the first two assaults, the first assault, they just pushed through, and they overran a few of the Marine positions. They actually took out some of the 37 millimeter gunners. And some of the Marines, infantry guys who knew a little bit about, I think one guy knew how to fire a 37. He just grabbed some volunteers and said, jump on this 37. So obviously between that and the Marine machine guns, we're getting a lot of Japanese fire. There's one story, you got 3 Marines. They made a movie out of it too. It was Schmidt, Rivers, and Diamond. Let me get this right. Johnny Rivers was on the machine gun. They're all on a heavy machine gun crew, and he's firing. Then he gets shot and killed. Apparently he's supposed to fire another 200 rounds. And then they push him to the side. And then Al Schmidt gets on the gun. He's firing, and Diamond's the team leader. He's directing. Then, obviously the Japanese were concentrating their fire on their bunker, because they were killing a lot of Japanese. That was their main bunker. The Japanese had to take that bunker out. And, Japanese grenades were landing left or right. Well, I think it was either a Japanese grenade or a Japanese knee mortar round landed and permanently blinded Schmidt. So his face was, he suffered wounds he couldn't see. Then I think Diamond his arms were wounded. He couldn't fire. So they became a team. Then they kept firing. So Diamond's was his eyes and Schmidt was his hands. So they, both earned Navy Crosses. I think all 3 earned Navy Crosses. And Johnny Rivers. And so I think it was a movie. I forgot the movie. It's actually made during the war. Schmidt, somebody, I know it. So they stopped 2 attacks. So the Japanese decided what they'll do. They had some of the engineers try to go across the river at one point, but they didn't go too far. But what Ichiki said, okay, well, obviously these guys are more than we expected. It's what I'll do my 3rd assault. It was getting toward daybreak. And instead of going across the sandbar, they went out into the ocean a bit, came down, bypassed the sandbar, and was going to attack straight up the beach. Well, they ran straight into, there's a good photo I got. It shows a pillbox, and it shows, in fact, there's a famous time life photo, so the Japanese half buried in the sand. It looks like they're sleeping. There's a famous Japanese time life photo. The Japanese are in the sand. And that was the element that tried to attack up the beach or from the ocean. Sorry, they come in from the ocean.
I've seen that photo.
Yeah, so they wiped out all 3 assaults. Now, when daylight fully broke, the Japanese at that stage, there's a bit of contention of how Ichiki died. They said, well, I think the Japanese had came up with a great story as, he was so dishonored and ashamed that he went back with his adjutant and he burned his colors and he committed
seppuku.
Yeah, seppuku. That sounds good. But knowing probably the leader he was and there's been some reports, not too many Japanese lived there. They thought he probably died in the 3rd assault, leading the 3rd assault.
I'd imagine
he lead the last assault, because there's a few elements that come in, because after that 3rd assault, the Japanese appeared very disorientated, very disorganized. They had no leaders. I think all their leaders actually died, including Ichiki. So the Marines, they said, well, the Japanese are over there. They're not doing any more assault. We can see them across in the coconut groves. That's when the Marine commander says, they're over there. I want to get them out. So what they did was then they had another battalion basically envelop So they went down the creek and came up and cut the Japanese off and enveloped them. Then had the Marine tank platoon come across the sandbar, and then they just basically killed the Japanese. And that's what you see in the Pacific series, where some Japanese tried to surrender and they blew themselves up with grenades, or they tried to kill the Marines. And that was when the Marines first seen it, how the Japanese fought, as in not surrendering. And anyway, they were out of like 1,000 Japanese, I think only 100 made it back. Or even 900 made it back. I think about 30 or 40 made it back. They had 100 left in the rear guard.
Yeah, he left a rear guard of 100, and he had like 30 something guys that escaped.
Made it back.
Yeah.
And some did try to surrender, but the Marines wouldn't take any surrender, because I'll mention briefly about the Getchie Patrol. And the Getchie Patrol was the reconnaissance patrol on August 12th with the division colonel, intel officer. And he led this patrol, and they were basically, I won't go into detail about it, but they were basically killed. And there was a Japanese warrant officer, naval warrant officer, had captured, and the story was the Japanese had a white flag and they were trying to surrender. Then it was this deceitful, and they ambushed the Marines and they butchered them. Now, butchering them is fact. They did butcher them, but probably now we know that it wasn't a elaborate trick. The white flag was probably the normal Japanese flag, with the red meatball, they call it, the red signal in the middle. The warrant officer, as soon as they were landing that night, he was saying, "Oh, you're landing in the wrong place. I don't want to land here. These guys they're pretty," because they'd reinforced. I think a week later with some Japanese special naval landing infantry guys and some guard company guys, and they didn't want to surrender because they thought there would be some Japanese construction troops would surrender. But anyway, that kind of set the stage. I call it the Marines' blood vendetta for the rest of the Pacific War. Because even, if you read Eugene Sledge's great memoir, he talks about, even being told about this in 1944, and it was like a rallying cry, even in boot camp, remember Getchie, remember these deceitful Japanese, they're tricky. So that set the stage for the Marines with that mindset. And then when you had the Battle of Alligator Creek, where these guys wasn't surrendering, and even the division commander said, "I've never seen troops such as these," the Marine division commander, he said, "These guys don't surrender. They're deceitful and they're tricky." And then when they're trying to blow themselves up, or trying to lure the Marines in and take as many Marines out, that kind of set the stage. So after that, the Marines basically had an unwritten rule. We're not, especially the Marine infantry guys on the front line, we're not taking prisoners. They don't take prisoners, and we don't take prisoners. The Japanese did take some American prisoners in Guadalcanal campaign, but they killed them shortly after that, after they, tortured them and tried to get some information, or just bayoneted them just to make them scream and yell, a common tactic to make the other guys a bit scared, so to speak, but didn't work with the Marines. Anyway, after that battle, so the Japanese, the second echelon landed over Chiki about a week later. So the Japanese thought, okay, well, this is more serious than we thought.
It was the first major loss for the Japanese. It was an eye opener for ground forces.
Yes, being in Australia, get a quick argument about what was the first, land defeat in the Milne Bay, which was a week later. And so it's always argued. Both of them were good defeats. I mean, Milne Bay was the first, I guess, overall. They say Alligator Creek's a local. And Milne Bay, they were completely turned back, which they were. So they're both, not to take anything away from Milne Bay or Alligator Creek. I mean, it's one of those pride things, ego things on both sides. We had the first one, So the Japanese were set back a bit. They still thought wasn't that many Marines there. And Port Moresby was their main objective. And the Japanese army thought, well, this is getting a bit out of hand now. We don't want to commit any more forces because we want all our reinforcements to go into PNG. But they had a brigade at that stage called the 35th. Oh, I'll bring it back to the Air Force. Air Force, the Marines air landed on the 20th. They actually helped out on the 21st. They flew the Japanese. Yeah, they strafed the Japanese Alligator Creek. So everyone got involved in this poor Japanese. They were getting smashed by everyone.
Yeah, it was Japanese who were trying to escape during the battle on a part of a beach, and then the Cactus Air Force came in and strafed them.
Oh yeah, they were getting everything. They were getting tanks. In fact, there was an old Marine gunnery sergeant supposed to be one of the best shots in the division. He won all these rifle competitions in the 30s and 20s and things. And I forgot what his name, gunnery sergeant. And when the Japanese were out in the ocean, just trying to escape, he walked up and he had his old campaign hat, like the drill instructor hat. He had a shooting jacket, like the normal range shooting jacket. And he stood there and he got in a nice position. He put his sling on. And the guys were watching him. They go, "Oh, here he goes, our best shot." And a couple of first rounds he missed. And they went, "Oh, what's going on here?" Then apparently he got his, what do they call it? He got his groove in a bit. Then he started shooting a lot of Japanese, poor guys. But yeah, so it set the stage, and I had a 35th Brigade, and you've mentioned them in some of your podcasts and YouTube. Kawaguchi's Brigade.
Yep.
I forgot where they were at, somewhere in the Pacific. They're what's Kawaguchi, Sumatra, I think.
Oh, I'm not sure.
35th Brigade. Anyway, they were trained, and they were part of the South Seas Detachment, and they were slated to go into on the Kokoda to reinforce. They were going to be the first main reinforcements, I believe, to assist those guys. Anyway, they had to divert them. They said, okay, Kawaguchi had about 6,000 guys, and they were based around the 124th Regiment. So yeah, they took the 35th Brigade, and Kawaguchi is probably the best overall Japanese commander. I mean, it's arguably of the whole campaign. So what they did with Kawaguchi, they landed at Tabu Point. And some of his guys, like Colonel Oka, was the division or the regimental commander of 124th. Him and his headquarter group, another battalion, landed on the west side, and Kawaguchi and the rest of his guys landed at Tabu Point, same place as Chiki, just due to shipping. So they landed, and what they were going to do is the reconnaissance planes were flying over, and they seen how the Marines were reinforced on the flanks and in the front, but they didn't have anyone in the back. And if you look at a map with Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge, it goes straight to the airfield. Oh, sorry, I got a cat going crazy here. He always does this. Only when I'm on a podcast or something, he'll do this.
Oh, I know full well. I have two parrots, and that's why I've been clicking the mute button this entire podcast, because they keep screaming like my name and stuff.
Well, he's got his arm coming through the door, pushing the door, and it's like quite funny, making me laugh. No, he's got
Kawaguchi was Sumatra, if I remember. We covered that not too long ago. Yeah,
no, it's pretty good. So they landed in Kawaguchi's plan. He goes, well, I know I'm going to be moving all my units through the night, typical Japanese tactics, and I need a concentrated point or a place I can move them quite quickly. And Bloody Ridge is only 1,000 yards away from the airfield. If you look at a map, coming straight out of the jungle, if they hit on top of that ridge, you could put his a couple of 3,000 guys at that stage he had with him. You go straight down that ridge. So yeah, Bloody Ridge forms a natural line straight to it's like a dagger, so to speak, or a highway straight to the airfield. So the reconnaissance flights and the reconnaissance had picked up this is basically undefended. They also had captured an American Army pilot like a week earlier, and they obviously tortured him. And he said he confirmed that the rear of the Marine lines were basically undefended. I think he was one of the 67th pursuit squadrons of the P-400s.
I've never heard of this. Huh.
Yeah, and anyway, the Marines had squads up there with the engineers and had a combat outpost and was very undefended. It's actually a good plan. So what he was going to do, the second echelon, Chiki, the guys that the Chiki didn't wait for, the rest of his unit, they call them the Bear Battalion, mainly his heavy guns like 37, 47 millimeter anti-tanks and a few other infantry guys. They were going to hit on the right flank, a place called the Overland Trail. I have a good video on that. William Barsh, a good historian, actually wrote a good article about I think got the name of the title, but it's a good article about it. And Attaby wrote a book too about the Overland Trail. and it's very perfectly preserved. So if you go on my YouTube site, you'll see it. Anyway, that was going to be one diversionary attack. A second diversionary attack was going to come from Colonel Oka and his battalion, going to hit the Marines' western flank. So it was going to be a simultaneous attack. So there were going to be two flank attacks to draw. See, once again, the Japanese thought the Marines only had about 3,000 guys spread out over 15 miles. So that's why they thought they could concentrate a few thousand Japanese in one area. They'll just overrun the Marines. So two simultaneous attacks on the flank. Then the main attack with Kawaguchi and his 3 battalions. So basically a reinforced regiment was going to come straight up and over the ridge, straight into the airfield and overrun the airfield. Great plan. But unlike most of the 3 main Japanese attack on Guadalcanal, it was uncoordinated. They underestimated the terrain, the jungle. I mean, contrary to what a lot of people think, Japanese weren't expert jungle fighters that people tend to make them.
They're just willing to take the risk.
Exactly. They did. They looked at it and they said, well, if we could do it, potentially we will do it. And once we commit ourselves to the attack, we have to keep attacking.
Yeah, because
even though if the odds are
arrive,
yeah, I forgot what the Japanese called it, but their doctrine said if especially in those early days, they didn't even talk about defense hardly. There's all everything's about attack. Even if the odds are against us, we will still attack. That was our doctrine, our philosophy. Anyway, they moved in. The Marines at that stage had it undefended. So Colonel Edson and the First Raiders, they brought them from Tulagi. They put them in a rest area around Lunga. And there was reports that the Japanese had a supply base at Tavu Point at Tanimbogo. And Edson asked the chief of staff, Thomas of the 1st Marine Division, he says, look, we're raiders. Let us do an amphibious assault or do a raid on their supply dump. So they, on the, I'm trying to think, the 10th of September, 42, they did a raid on there. Anyway, they not to go into too much detail on that, they overran their supply dump and destroyed a lot of their supplies, and that was Kawaguchi's main supply base. They destroyed some of his artillery, all his supplies. So they didn't have any food, just was on there carrying. So their logistics was cut off. And then once he did the raid, they moved back to the Lunga perimeter in their boats, the Marines. Well, Kawaguchi, some of his commanders said, let's turn back and fight these guys. He goes, no, let's continue on with our plan. So Edson came back and he spoke, him and the Thomas, which the chief of staff, spoke to the division commander, says, look, these guys, we know there are about 3,000 of them, 3,000 to 4,000. They're moving through the jungle. Division commander thought they were going to hit them on the same flanked that October 21st with the Alligator Creek. They're going to hit us there again. But Thomas and Edson says, no, if I was that commander, I would attack straight out of the jungle. And then once the scouts said they started to turn and go into the jungle, so they're coming this way. The only way they could really sell it to division commander, Edson says, look, my troops are a bit tired. Can we at least move up on that Bloody Ridge? And at that stage, the 1st Marine Division had moved their command posts up on Bloody Ridge to get away from the V ring, they call it, like the center ring, because every day the Japanese were bombing the area around Henderson, and the 1st Marine Division headquarters are very near Henderson. So they moved his headquarters up on the ridge. He says, can we move up on the ridge just to be your bodyguards at least, or give my guys a bit of a rest? They goes, yeah, move them up there. So they moved up there. They were there for about 3 or 4 hours resting. And then Edson says, start digging in. So the Marine Raiders is all this hell of a rest area we got here. So they started digging in what limited supplies they had, like a few strands of barbed wire, and then it's all coral regions, so they didn't dig too deep. And he set his guys up in the line, and he waited for the Japanese. And then the Japanese at that stage didn't know the Marines were up there. I think some of their scouts that went up and the reconnaissance planes were flying over, and they've probably seen, yep, there are some Marines here. So instead of tacking up and over, what we'll do, we'll flank them. Infiltration, we'll go around them and cut them off, and then go by the Lunga River and cut them off and hit the airfield that way. So on the night of the 13th to 14th, 13th to 14th, Kawaguchi only had 1 battalion ready to go. Everyone was, a couple of them were like ran each other. Other ones were lost in the jungle. You only have one ready to go. Now, the day before, the Japanese would bomb Henderson. But the day before, they actually dropped some bombs actually on Bloody Ridge itself, or Edson's Ridge. And that's another thing, let the Marines know, okay, they are coming, because they've started bombing the ridge now. So I think 30 minutes before the assault, the Japanese had a couple of cruisers and some destroyers. They'd come through every night. They'd drop supplies off, and they'd swing by the Marine positions and bombard the Marine positions.
Tokyo Express?
Yeah. And the rat runs, they called them too. The Japanese called them rat runs. The Marines called them Tokyo Express. And they'd come in and they put the spotlights on Edson's Ridge itself. And they started bombarding it a bit. A lot of it was overshooting actually the ridge and hitting in the assembly areas of the Japanese. So they weren't doing the Japanese that good. But Kawaguchi, he already committed to the assault. So one battalion of his 3 was only assaulted that night. So they managed to go around the Marines' flank, and C Company of the Raiders, they overran C Company, and they were in like platoon-size elements, outposts, and they pushed them back a bit. And then daylight came, and the Marines, and they were in the jungles. And Edson knew there were 3,000. He only knew about 600 or 700 attack. He thought, well, they're coming back tonight. So his line was kind of like that, and it was refused a bit, and he had 3 lines. And he said, if the Japanese attack would all they got, they're going to cut my 2 companies, cut them out or surround them. So what he did, he moved his front line back to his second line. He had 3 lines. Moved back to the second line about 400 yards. That opened up about 150 yards. If you see my videos, you'll see about 150 yards of open terrain. And then the Marines had brought their artillery up. Their artillery was like a real dominating factor. That was one of the reasons the Japanese attacked at night, to try to lessen the Marines' firepower, but it didn't work. So they brought 75 millimeter battery up. They had 105 105s by the airfield, and they were ready to go. And they pre-registered all the fires, all the sites. Everything was pre-registered. They were waiting for the Japanese the second night. So at that stage, the Marine Raiders had the 1st Marine paratroopers attached to them to form one battalion, because they were pretty much decimated. They'd lost a lot of casualties at Gavutu, the para guys, but they formed them in one battalion, about 800 guys all up. So the second night, the Japanese attacked with 2 battalions straight up, and they did multiple assaults. Their 3rd battalion was out of the fight, almost the whole fight. I think they committed maybe 1 company, maybe 2 companies, if that. But once again, Kawaguchi, he didn't have all his 3 battalions ready to go.
He was stuck in the jungle the whole time.
Oh, yeah, it was very frustrating. He's just the most frustrated he's been in his life. So they attacked piecemeal, and they did multiple assaults. The Marines finally moved back to the last Hill 2, Edson's command post, and they formed a ring around that. And the artillery was just smashing the Japanese, the Marines grenades, the Marines, holding their, because they were raiders, they were pretty good troops, so they were holding the ground. They held. They barely held, but they held when daylight came. Well, the Japanese diversionary attacks, they had one with the Kuma battalion. They attacked across a field at the Overland Trail, and they were basically stopped. The next day, the Marines, just the most tank casualties they had in the campaign, the Marines took a tank platoon. I think it had six, including the lieutenant command tank, attacked across the field, unsupported by infantry. The Japanese had some 47 and 37 millimeter anti-tank guns. Took out 2 tanks very quickly, and another Marine tank dropped into the Tenaroo River. They all drowned. So the Marines lost 3 tanks real quick in that campaign, in that bit. But the other one was attack on L Company of 3-5, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, L Company Ridge. So anyone's ever been there, it's where the golf course is now. So they attacked there, Colonel Oka. And once again, they attacked up a ridge, and they were beaten back quite quickly too. So all 3 assaults, all 3 were failures. And then Kawaguchi, instead of going back to Taboo Point, he had to go back the other way. So he went back to the Matanikau, which is out to the west, and without no supplies or any food. And he lost a lot of guys in the jungle.
Yeah, it was a bad one. They had to pick up the wounded. They left all their equipment because they were starving to death, and they were getting picked off a bit too.
I think about 600 to 700 Japanese died at Bloody Ridge. How many died in the jungle. Marines had about 150 casualties. And in fact, it was the closest, the great historian Richard Frank, Guadalcanal historian, said this is probably the closest in his opinion, that the Marines ever came to losing the battle. Because if they would have pushed through with thousands of Japanese and took the airfield, once the Marines lost the airfield, then it would have been hard to, you know.
Especially given the naval battles that happened after, because it was things were swinging in the ocean after this one, and depending how the Japanese even did with that, consolidating the Solomon Islands could have been an opportunity. It would have happened, maybe. Yeah,
exactly. But Bloody Ridge is very very important in the Pacific campaign, because at that stage, that's where the Japanese high command. In fact, the day after Bloody Ridge, Japanese high command in Tokyo had an emergency meeting, and they worked out that, okay, the Marines are here to stay. There's probably more than we anticipated, and the Americans have kind of like drew a line in the sand and said, we're going to be fighting for this island. So the Japanese couldn't maintain two main thrusts at that stage, one being PNG or Papua New Guinea, and the other one being Guadalcanal. So what they did at that time, they said, Papua New Guinea and Port Moresby is not our main objective anymore. Our main objective will be Guadalcanal. So any resources, any supplies, any reinforcements we have going into PNG with the Port Moresby and the Kokoda, everything now goes to Guadalcanal. They told the South Seas commander on the Kokoda, who could actually see the lights of Port Moresby. I mean, they were pretty decimated at that stage, and they were waiting for the 35th Brigade, which just got wiped out basically in Guadalcanal, to reinforce them. So they told that commander, all right, withdraw and hold in place as best you can. As soon as we wipe these Americans out of Guadalcanal, we will send all our reinforcements to you. But then that gave the Australians, especially when they get in their regular forces back, enough time to regroup and to push back over the Kokoda. And then there's a big what if. What if, there was almost 40,000 Japanese was pumped into Guadalcanal. What if they had been pumped into PNG? They would probably took Port Moresby. I don't know. It's a big what if, a lot of what ifs. But that was that's why Bloody Ridge is a very important battle, not alone just for Guadalcanal, but for the Kokoda campaign at the same time. It affected quite a bit.
Japanese High Command said this is now going to be a decisive battle. Guadalcanal is important. Changed a lot.
Yeah, it did. So you can see, I probably don't know how long we went, but then the cat got bored. He ran off now. I'm not playing with him. So you can see I could go off in different little tracks to cover each in detail. That's Alligator Creek and Bloody Ridge. So I took them up at the Marines. They're at the stage now. So it's September the 14th or 15th at the end of Bloody Ridge. And the first big resupply the Marines had came in September the 18th. It was a major reinforcement of supply, and it brought in a very, very fresh and very good unit, which was the 7th Marine Regiment. So the whole division was entirely together. And it also gave Vandergrift a chance, fresh troops. He could, garrison or man his perimeter 360, and plus it gave him room to go on the offensive a bit. So he knew there was a few Japanese near the Matanakau River, which was a few miles to the west, and he wanted to wipe those guys out and push them back. He wanted to keep the Japanese way away from Matanakau and to preserve the airfield. So it gave him a chance. This is when Chesty Puller and the rest of them landed on 17th of August. And the depleted parachute battalion at that stage, as soon as the 7th Marines landed the 18th, they put the battalion parachute guys on those same transports on the way out. I think they were down like 25% of the original force. But the Raiders were still there, and they thought they were going to go away with the para battalions, but they still had things in store for the Raiders, unfortunately, for those guys.
And it got a lot scarier with the losses from the Navy.
Then
a lot of big surprises.
Well, naval campaigns, you had 7 major naval battles around Guadalcanal.
Everybody focuses on Midway, but just alone in the Solomon Islands, the naval battles are extremely intense. And then later on in history, you got Leyte Gulf, which is by far the craziest naval battle.
We talk about the naval aviators too. Some people say the naval aviators of the Japanese were destroyed at Midway, and nowhere close. The 6-month campaign in the Solomon Islands destroyed the Japanese naval. I forgot, it was almost 600 something planes the Japanese lost in the Guadalcanal campaign, and most of its crews too.
It's
very
interesting
experienced naval crews. Yeah.
because you would say that the Japanese had a tactical victory when they took out the USS Wasp or Saratoga and stuff, but in essence, they had lost so much of their veteran aviators that couldn't be replaced. And the Americans were just pumping out every year entire fleets and trained personnel. So Japanese were just getting dwindled down.
No, exactly. And that was, the battle of attrition. That was what the Guadalcanal was, the attrition campaign. And we're only up to September, so I know you guys are about to cover Guadalcanal too, and you're going a lot more detail, especially about the naval. And in Guadalcanal was the first time you had a naval, air, and land campaign at such a large scale in military history.
Yeah.
Simultaneously at once. It was the first time in especially U.S. military history where you had the forces working together. Look at the Cactus Air Force. It's a classic. You had naval, U.S. Army at that stage, wasn't Air Force, but U.S. Army Air Force and Marine aviators fighting together. And a hybrid unit was fought quite well together.
Yeah, well, the Americans, the Army and the Navy fought well together. The Japanese did a good job of fighting each other for most of the
yes,
war.
exactly. Well, Americans had, the Allies, U.S. had that too, especially with the high command. I wouldn't say the lower command, but the high command fought each other. And just a bit of I'm thinking about it too. The U.S. Army was at Guadalcanal. In fact, there was more U.S. Army at Guadalcanal than U.S. Marines in the end. But the U.S. Army didn't really come in until October.
Yeah.
And really, obviously they set the stage in December, January, in the big campaigns around there when the Japanese did finally go on the defensive. The thin red line and all that the movies depict. Yeah.
I haven't seen the Thin Red Line in so long. Oh my God.
Oh, don't get me started. The part where it depicts, supposed to depict where Charles Davis earned the Medal of Honor, attacking a bunker, and the actor in the modern, they made like 2 movies, the Thin Red Line, the modern one with John Cusack. He loosely plays Captain Davis.
Yeah. That's
probably the most perfectly preserved battlefield on Guadalcanal. It's called the Galloping Horse battlefield. No one lives on it. Well, I think one hut. But anyway, I could talk forever, so I think we're getting on a bit.
Yeah, this has been a great episode. I think we have to do this again soon.
Yeah, well, like I said, we're up to September the 17th or 18th.
Yeah, we can cover. I'll leave it up to you and your decisions. What you like, what you're interested the most in. But certainly still a lot to be said about Guadalcanal. Still got the fight for Henderson Field that's going to be raging on. And the starvation of the Japanese until they finally leave.
Yeah, the next big battle is the Battle of Henderson Field. That's the last Japanese offensive, I think, in the whole Pacific War.
Yeah.
Battle of Henderson Field in October. Then you have the Americans attacking in Mount Austin fights in January, February.
That one's not talked about as much.
No, because everyone thinks, not everyone, like I say everyone, I don't mean everyone, but a lot of people, the popular, history of Guadalcanal is the Marines are there. After the 1st Marine Division left, and after 4 months, that was it. But, 2nd Marine Division, a lot of people don't even know the 2nd Marine Division was there. 2nd Marine Division fought in entirety.
It shoots to Peleliu real quick when it comes to, even most books you read, it shoots right to Peleliu and goes from there. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this interview. And if you like, please tell the audience again, more about your YouTube channel so they know where to check out your stuff.
Yeah, it's maybe you'll put it in the link or not links, but it's called Guadalcanal Walking the Battlefield, and it's on YouTube. It's Guadalcanal Walking the Battlefield, and the Facebook's the same one. And at this stage, I think I have like 38 videos, and I'm about to release the Getchi Patrol. So if you want to know about the Getchi Patrol in detail, I've almost got that ready to release. I'll probably be recording it tomorrow, the next day. I've got it, all the slides and things ready to go. And a lot of then and now photos. I've got some photos of the Getchi area from the 18th of August. A few days after it actually occurred, when the Marines went in after these guys. So I'm about to do that one. I just did Lunga Company Ridge. I just talked about there, diversionary attack. I did both diversionary attacks, and I think I got 3 videos just on Bloody Ridge itself. And I covered the Medal of Honor ones, the Barcelona position, which is probably the most popular one.
Yeah.
Page.
Well, yeah, Barcelona is going to be the all-star every man.
Yeah, so I go down into the positions where he earned his Medal of Honor. We talk a bit about Barcelona there. But yeah, that's where you can find it. Just Guadalcanal, walking a battlefield.
Perfect. So go check him out, everybody. And well, this has been the Pacific War podcast week by week. Over and out. I would like to take this time to all remind you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, if you're still hungry after all that for some more Pacific War content, why don't you give my personal channel a look over at the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I have recently made a series dedicated to General Rupertus during the Battle for Guadalcanal. Give it a look, it meant a lot to me.